Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the 33rd installment of Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History. I'm Dan Atrell, and today we're going to be discussing Hellenism in Egypt. So, recently in our chronology, we've been dealing with the death of Alexander the Great in 323, just before his sojourn in India. Today, however, we're going to take another general look at the interactions of the Hellenistic Greeks and that great, seemingly timeless kingdom they called Egypt. I'm going to try to cover a lot of information here, but I'm not going to let myself get bogged down by specific dates and names. I want to try to give a more general feel for what Hellenistic Egypt was like, particularly in regards to magic, religion, and philosophy, rather than a dry rundown of Ptolemaic annals. So, after a generation of civil wars over the succession of Alexander, a new cultural and political landscape emerged, wherein the regions conquered by the Macedonians were carved up into huge dynastic blocks. The first and most well documented of these dynastic blocks was that of the infamous Ptolemies, namely in Egypt. Ptolemy had been part of Alexander's own retinue. He was one of his bodyguards and generals, and as soon as Alexander passed on, it struck Ptolemy that out of all the satrapies of the old Achaemenid Persian Empire, that of Egypt could be most easily self-sustained and defended. Egypt is somewhat self-contained, with deserts on either side of the Nile, cataracts or whitewater rapids to the south, and the delta to the north. Over the course of his life, Ptolemy took over this region under the pretense of being one of Alexander's satraps, a local governor, if you will. By the end of his life, however, Ptolemy had fully drunk the Kool-Aid, so to speak, and taken on the mantle of God-King Pharaoh. As far as his Egyptian audience was concerned, he was a god on earth, though the rest of the Mediterranean would not share this perspective. Let's not forget that despite countless invasions of Egypt and the constant replacement of its upper crust, ground-level working-class Egyptians had a relative degree of cultural, ethnic, and linguistic stability which stretched back to the founding of the pyramids. As per usual, things don't usually change much on the ground level. This is a dominant theme in this series. Change is most apparent among the elites when one regime replaces another. Egypt, overall, was a very stable society in its art, in its language, and in its customs, and in its way of life. And ultimately, this makes it a wonderful place to see how Hellenism actually works. The Greeks and Macedonians only replaced the upper classes and the ruling elite, with Ptolemy himself taking over the role of both pharaoh and Persian governor. There was really no attempt to fuse the Greek and the Egyptian ethnic groups. This was more so a type of exercise in colonialism than multiculturalism. In the 3rd century, if if you don't speak Greek, you'll probably have a bad time working with your new foreign overlords. There was little to no intermarriage, and for the most part, the two ethnic groups lived separately from one another. Alexandria stood quite at odds with the rest of Egypt, since it had begun, like most other cities Alexander founded, as a garrison and a trading post. The fact that this Alexandria flourished into so great a city, while the other 70 cities Alexander planted did not, is purely a matter of historical consequence. Ptolemy had no wish to rule from Memphis or Thebes, but rather from this new outpost on the Nile Delta, which was essentially at the outskirts of the Egyptian world. Egyptians weren't even allowed in Alexandria without explicit permission through a sort of passport. Ultimately, the Ptolemaic dynasty were sort of like absentee landlords. As much as they wanted to collect the wealth from Egypt, they really had their eyes turned toward the broader Mediterranean system. Greece, Persia, Anatolia, the Levant, and so forth. All trade coming in from the Mediterranean had to pass through Greek agents first. So, in other words, they had a strong monopoly on the whole of the Egyptian economy. Ptolemy took a cut at every level. On the contracts, on the storage of goods, on the product itself, on tariffs, on certifications, and so on and so forth. As I always say, know that I am gangsta and I rule this land with an iron fist. That's their credo. Needless to say, the Ptolemies got ludicrously rich from this. They hoarded all the gold and silver bullion for themselves, which came in by means of Mediterranean trade, and then, as a nice slap in the face, they issued a bunch of copper coins for use by the Egyptian peasantry. And these coins had literally no value outside of Egypt. Does this sound familiar to anything you know today? It should. This copper coinage, this fundamentally shut down free trade and private commerce, leaving Egyptians crippled in their ability to trade with anyone other than themselves and their Greek overlords. It should go without saying that the people of Egypt were not pleased, and insurrections were frequent. Greek agents under the Ptolemies were brutally exploitative. They really ran all the shots in a sort of ancient dystopian nightmare. They monitored the trade and supplies of Egyptian grain. They distributed the seed and determined who got it and who didn't. They announced when the planting season began, when harvests began. They monitored the use of tools. They watched the use of water. They cautiously policed peasants. They took very careful inventory of all the grain and stamped all the right documents before shipping everything off to Alexandria for export. They really had Egypt in an economic vice grip. They controlled the very energy which sustained life in the region, and they manipulated its flows according to their own designs. Their rule was not about justice, as propaganda would have one believe. This rule was about exploitation. There were taxes and tolls everywhere you went, and this is all very well documented in a wealth of surviving papyri. These were complaints by Egyptian peasants, chiefly written in Greek, which of course means it had been necessary for them to hire a translator and scribe to get into contact with any level of Egyptian administration. Throughout this period, and until the coming of Rome, Greek bureaucracy had a chokehold on everything. The Ptolemies undertook changes that went far beyond any other measure that earlier foreign rulers had imposed. Though they established a prosperous kingdom, and they enhanced it with a number of fine buildings and public works, the native population enjoyed very few benefits. To the Greeks, the Ptolemies had to act like kings. To the Egyptians, however, they had to act like pharaohs, like the upholders of Maat's principles, and largely this was like walking on a razor's edge as far as PR and propaganda is concerned. They really had to play the game gently. If your head got too big from being God King, you'd alienate your court as a man of hubris. If you didn't convincingly take on this role, you'd lose all legitimacy in the eyes of the people. If you go to Karnak today and get there before the Islamic State spreads into Egypt and blows it up, gods forbid, try to see if you can tell the difference between the images of Tutmosis III and Ptolemy. The aesthetic continuity is crazy. From the time of the Narmer palette, to the collapse of the Bronze Age Mediterranean system, to the 300s BC, there's hardly a difference in the art. Ptolemy stuck his hand right into that seemingly timeless tradition, and for all intents and purposes, he was Pharaoh. Just not to any Greeks. By choosing Memphis as his coronation site, Alexander had underlined the eternal nature of Pharaoh and associated himself with Old Kingdom traditions, which by this point had long become an archaic style, but had since become fashionable again under the reign of the Ethiopian dynasty. From this point onward, all the Ptolemies would be crowned in Memphis, even though they never wanted to live there. This sort of thing is indicative of a strong cooperation between the priesthood of Ptah, standing in for Egyptian priesthood in general, and the Greek elites. Alexander had sacrificed to Apis, believing in his own divine superhuman nature, and on his deathbed he demanded to be buried in the Ammonion of Siwa. This set the precedent for much of the way the Ptolemies perceived themselves. Alexander was the legitimate heir of the pharaohs, and the Ptolemies were the legitimate heirs of Alexander. Now, it seems that nobody knew better than Ptolemy that the Pharaonic system was absolutely necessary to enable his dynasty to survive his death. He understood that by giving offerings to the temples, by erecting monuments, and by ensuring a sort of dignified royal administration and military, he could keep the literate, pre-rational elites of Egypt in his back pocket, all the while benefiting from the bountiful fruits of Kem, the Black Land. Native Egyptians, especially elites, had despised the old Persian rule, and they thus welcomed a new pharaoh who would restore and maintain the old traditions. Religion and tradition became express tools for increasing power and wealth. Claiming descent from Heracles, Dionysus, Zeus, and Amun played an important role in Ptolemaic propaganda, and of course, the best way to keep this descent pure was to maintain a recurrent brother-sister marriage a la Isis and Osiris, or Zeus and Hera, though this practice would not be entirely consistent. When Ptolemy I Soter crowned himself king of Egypt, he enshrined a new god, Serapis, which was a combination of two Egyptian gods, Apis and Osiris, plus the main Greek gods, Zeus, Hades, Asclepios, Dionysus, and Helios. This hypersyncretic figure was chiefly concerned with wisdom, fertility, the sun, corn, funerary rites, regeneration, and medicine. Isis, on the other hand, whose name literally means throne, maintained her traditional form as an ideal mother and wife, as well as the patroness of nature and magic. As the personification of the throne, she was an important representation of the pharaoh's power. It's during this period that Egypto-Greco-Babylonian theurgy comes into full swing. That is, astral magic by means of talismans, images, or statues. Sometimes this so-called theurgy was private, esoteric, and occult. At other times, it was fully public. Small nods from specially prepared statues being carried about town square were adequate enough to give simple yes or no answers, though for priests, magicians, and theurgists, this belief in entity-filled statues was far more developed. This is the root of so-called daimonic magic, the kind you would ultimately find in popular grimoires like the Picatrix or Solomon's Lesser Key, wherein sigils, images, and statues are used as vessels for disembodied intelligences. This sort of thing was generally carried out by trained professionals rather than by peasants. Divination by dream interpretation was also a common practice in Egyptian temples at this time. divine revelation in general, a direct experience of something very strange, other than what you'd experience on a regular day-to-day basis. This sort of thing would ultimately become the common thread among all Hermetic traditions, and it all starts here with this reconceptualized Greco-Egyptian religion. Along with all of these more or less traditional Egyptian religious practices, which were ultimately recapitulations of Old Kingdom practices, I should mention the development of a trend which had only started in the late New Kingdom. This trend essentially consisted in attributing less and less importance to worldly success, that is, one's position within the pharaonic state, and paying more attention to the inward man. Even modesty, accepting the way things are, this starts popping up its head as a newfound value. More and more, Egyptians came to believe that everything was determined and preordained by God's will, and I use the singular for God here loosely. Mat was the divine order or logos which governed the world, but living according to her or it was no longer practiced purely for material gain or prestige as it had been before. Rather, it was a demonstration of man's humility. We might ask ourselves to what extent this shift in consciousness was indigenous or prompted by external innovations in philosophy, the Stoicism of Greece, the Zoroastrianism of Persia, the Buddhism of India, and so forth. With this value firmly in place, the transition from Egyptian paganism, however complex, to the state cult of Christianity would come about all the more easily. Under the reign of the Persians, Babylonian stellar science came to Egypt, that is, astronomy/astrology, which were entirely indistinguishable from one another until the so-called European Enlightenment. In the Pegatrix, which is obviously a much later document written in Arabic, the two words are used interchangeably, even within a single sentence. As I mentioned before in one of our earliest lectures, if not the first, the Babylonians had been using a sexagesimal place value system. This permitted complex astronomical calculations, in particular with fractions. In Egyptian mathematics, there were only unit fractions. Astronomical phenomena had always possessed a great degree of mythological significance, even during the time before the pyramids were built. But now, with this commingling of all these foreign planet-worshipping cultures in Egypt, astrology became much more of a science than a mere Rorschach blot for shepherds, though to say this was ever really the case is admittedly being a bit dismissive. The determination of the Nile's floods perennially coinciding with the rising of Sirius, the calculation of the Sothic year, the connection between the moon and the tides, the division of the Heliacal decans, the hours, the calendars, and their relationship with Egyptian religion. Each of these are manifestations of that loving relationship which a well-fed, sedentary priesthood had with the vault of heaven above them. To look up and wonder was to worship, and thus to look up and start calculating was also a kind of spiritual practice. Now, I should probably make it clear that this popular concept that the movements of these 7 planets through the band of the zodiac could allow somebody to make predictions about the future, this was totally foreign to Egyptian astrology. It was chiefly the Chaldeans, or Babylonians, who had these theories for predicting individual events in the life of human beings, rather than just general collective events like weather. Let's not forget that Ptolemaic Egypt was essentially the birthplace of Greek astrology as we know it. Before this point, Greek astrology would have been unrecognizably crude and vague. We need to understand that this astrology craze that would sweep across the West was a result of learned Greeks settling in Persia following Alexander's conquests, learning Chaldean astrology, then migrating to Alexandria, and then from there to Rome. Only trained intellectuals could calculate the positions of the planets, because if you can't write down the positions of all these independently moving bodies, it's impossible to keep that many variables in mind over such a long time and still make any meaningful observations. Now, luckily for the Greeks, their philosophical climate from the time of Pythagoras onward had stressed the architectonic and geometric qualities of the universe. The orderly rhythm of the 7 orbiting heavenly spheres had been projected onto the musical intervals of the vibrating string, and the fact that somehow the movements of these planets reflected in numerical terms the motion of the gods themselves was a tremendous influence on the rationalizing and linearizing nature of Greek thought. With the right confirmation biases, this was proof that the universe was governed by orderly, rational principles, and if only man could govern himself by these same principles, he might enjoy that same blessedness which the gods themselves enjoyed. Thus, the move from Babylonian omencraft to Greek astrology, as we, or some of us, understand it today, ultimately took place in Ptolemaic Egypt at the start of the 3rd century BC. Western astrology, then, was one of the great culminating points in the merging of Egyptian, Persian, Chaldean, and Greek astral magic, astronomy, and geometry. It's no surprise, then, that most astrological grimoires from the Middle Ages simply assume a working knowledge of all of these disciplines. Rather than relying on the dubious whispers of priests in secret chambers for answers, now the will of the gods could simply be quote-unquote calculated or predicted. They could even show it to you on a chart. What ancient Ur set in motion as a system of pictures in the sky and their associated omens, that evolved into a Persian system for ascribing dynamic meanings to the positions of the planets and stars relative to one another. Under the influence of Alexandrian mathematics, the Chaldean standard of measurement system, the sidereal zodiac, was supplanted by the tropical standard, which refers to the ostensible but ultimately illusionary path of the sun around the Earth. By dividing this ecliptic into 12 tropical signs of 30 degrees, beginning at the eastern intersection of the celestial equator and the ecliptic, the vernal point of 0 degrees, aka the first point of Aries, the Greek astrologers converted from a stellar to a planetary reference system. Here, ideal standard relationships between these planets were given dynamical purposes. So this is where you get the whole 0 degrees is a conjunction, 60 degrees is a sextile aspect, 90 degrees is a square aspect, 120 degrees is a trine aspect, and 180 degrees is an opposition. Now, in addition to all this divvying the ecliptic in 12 parts, they also divided the horizon into 12 parts, thus allowing for the planets to be given even further positioning in a local segment called a house. Whereas the vernal point began the tropical zodiac, the ascendant was the cusp of the first house. Over time, astrology became prominent throughout the Hellenistic kingdoms, and thereby was tacked onto the already fatalistic tendencies of this age to create a whole new brand of astral fatalism. As I've said before, the Hellenistic era was a period of great doubt and insecurity. It seemed to some that a mere fact that calamities and twists of fate could be predicted made astrology too good to be true. The will of the gods could be read in the skies, but in all honesty, how many people were skilled enough to know otherwise? If all these brilliant philosophers and mathematicians were buying into it, how could you doubt their claims? Some did, most didn't. In the Hermetic text called the Asclepius, just before his lament for Egypt, Hermes declares, "Don't you know, Asclepius, that Egypt is a copy of heaven?" Or, to be more precise, the place where the operations that govern and put to work the celestial forces are transferred and projected down here. In fact, if truth is to be spoken, our land is the temple of the whole world. Now, the religious implications of astrology became tremendous. If this universe is but the machinations of glowing orbs in the heavens, governed by eternal and unchanging principles, and yet this world is a hell, then it begs the question, how do we escape this paradigm wherein an intelligent and ostensibly malevolent architect created the universe? Now, I don't want to get into this too much because we'd be moving too fast, but you can see here the low rumbling, the churning of those pessimistic, Gnostic ideas bubbling up to the surface. We'll come to this in great detail in the future. Let's stick to Hermeticism for now, and to do this, I want to get into a tiny bit of historiography. According to B.H. Stricker, who wrote in 1949, the Corpus Hermeticum was but a codification of Egyptian religion. Apparently Ptolemy Soter, the first Ptolemy, and his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus promised to help publish the secret literature of the three main groups of citizens in Egypt: the native Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Jews. In this reckoning, Hermeticism was believed to be the Greek version of a redaction of Egyptian literature. Its form, Stricker thought, was Greek, but its contents were Egyptian. On the other side of the debate, the Jesuit André-Jean Festugière, writing in 1945, believed that the corpus contained extremely few Egyptian elements, except for the context, with the ideas expressed being those of popular Greek philosophical thought. So, in other words, a mixture of Platonism, Aristotelianism, and Stoicism. Now, given these two extremes, as always, both positions should be avoided, or at least synthesized. A synthesis of sorts would stress the development under the first three Ptolemaic kings of a Greek intellectualization of an anti-rational Egyptian religion. It would be grounded in Alexandria and Memphis, and initially demonstrate a strong emphasis on the native component. It began among the priests and scribes and put great importance on the Egyptian ibis god Thoth, or Tohute, the god responsible for the word. As was the case with most other Greek interpretations of Egyptian gods, they eventually dropped the ibis guise and envisioned a new figure, Hermes Trismegistos, entirely human in appearance. Now, according to the Picatrix, written over 1,000 years after this period, it's said that Hermes was thrice great because he was simultaneously king, prophet, and philosopher. That's really the best and only reason I've ever heard for this title, so as far as I'm concerned, that's what being thrice great is all about. Ultimately, since Hellenization entailed using Koine Greek and participating in the syncretic intellectual climate, such as the Museion or museum, or the Serapeion or Serapeum, the native Egyptians clung to their old Hermopolitan and Memphite systems for some time. But generation after generation, they were assimilated by degree into a more Greek mode of thinking. Thus, the philosophy of Hermeticism became pretty thoroughly un-Egyptian and pretty thoroughly Neoplatonic in character. by the 2nd or 3rd centuries AD. The Corpus Hermeticum would, in due course, become our best window into this Greco-Egyptian religion which produced it. In it, we read wisdom literature. We see a reverence for the creative word. We understand the hermaphroditic nature of God. We reconcile the one and the many. We explore the power of magical images or statues. We find the sun as our creator and the cosmos as an ordered whole. Now, what we need to realize also, and I'm stressing this because I've had a lot of people complain that I talk about Jewish history too much, and frankly that's ridiculous, because their history is inextricably interconnected with that of Hermeticism, whether you like it or not. And this is that the philosophical dimensions of Alexandrian Hermeticism refer to material like, let's say, the Asclepius, as much as they do to works like the Jewish Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, and the Greek philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, all of whom I've discussed. So all in all, that Bible some of you scorn so much as a mere book of obstacles is as integral to the history of Western esotericism as is any dialogue between Egyptian gods or erudite Greeks. So, moving on. Just like it says in the Picatrix, quote-unquote, this science, that is Hermeticism, had two main parts, a practical component and a theoretical component. The theoretical component, it seems to me, was mostly rooted in Greek, Jewish, and the Persian side of things. But I don't want to drive this too far. This included things like the technical aspects of astrology, geometry, calculus, herbalism, metaphysics, and so forth. The more practical component, however, was quite thoroughly rooted in Egyptian image magic. Like I've said before, this is the sort of ritual magic that you'll find in much later grimoires like the Lesser Key of Solomon, full of sacrifices and invocations to stellar daimones. The native astrology at the time of Alexander's arrival was pretty un-Egyptian. What was practiced then was more so an astrology of Chaldeo-Persian origin. Before the arrival of the Persians into Egypt, some 2 centuries earlier, Egyptian astrology had chiefly been horary and agricultural. Of course, all the gods and pharaohs dwelled among the stars, and the importance of the sun god Re or Ra, among others, is quite obvious, and I suppose you could call that astrology, but now we're talking about different things. In 280 BC, a priest of Marduk named Berosus dedicated his treatise on Chaldean astrology called the Babyloniaca to Antiochus I. A cuneiform tablet dated to around 523 BC indicates the Babylonians' ability to calculate the conjunctions of the planets, monthly ephemerides for the sun and moon, and eclipses. The earliest horoscopes were Babylonian and written down starting from 410 BC. The Babylonian impression that all entities were subject to stellar conditions, this conflicted with the dignity the Egyptians granted to their gods, whose timeless and unchanging spirits abided in the stars. In the late period of Egyptian history, this Persian concept of using the planetary movements to symbolize human fate in all its fetters, and thereby to predict the will of the gods, found its recipients, especially during hard times. It's always easier to chalk up your problems to the evil machinations of the cosmos rather than accept them. Under the Ptolemies, which were hard times indeed, Egyptian priests studied Chaldean astrology intensely, and this train of thought took off. Hellenistic astrologers saw themselves as pious men. They were priests of an astral religion. Over the centuries, however, among fringe groups of devoted thinkers, there developed a sort of cult by which one might rise above the 7 planets which ordained the fates of men. Fate, or fortune, played a serious role in the consciousness of the Hellenistic age, not only in religious belief, but also in poetry and that new genre of literature which grew wildly popular during this time, the romance novel. In centuries to come, the 7 planets would be called archons. These were eons of a hypostatic god and rulers of the created world. Each of these archons presented a specific conundrum in the human character which had to be overcome. They were like valves which needed to be properly calibrated. Nothing too much, nothing too little, all this in order that the soul might rise meteorically back to the one upon the death of the body. Now, this need to escape this world, this is clearly un-Egyptian. Egyptians have often been thought to be obsessed with death, but nothing could be further from the truth. The whole purpose behind their elaborate funerary culture was so that they could carry on living in the afterlife. This is neither the so-called Gnostic conception of the world, nor the Stoic one. The wisdom of Egypt was chiefly ethical, social, and concerned with life in the here and now. Hermeticism, however, is chiefly individualistic, metaphysical, contemplative, and concerned with the inner mystical dimensions of human consciousness. Furthermore, Hermeticism inherited a sort of ascetic streak from the Greek philosophers and the Jewish scribes, which was not shared by the Egyptians. In its mature stages, Hermeticism became a kind of religio mentis, a religion of the mind for the ancient Mediterranean world. It gave substance, it gave a body to that unquenchable intellectual love for both the one and the many. The quote-unquote gnosis it passed on, that is, the secret knowledge it shared through initiation, were the techniques for achieving a trance state through intellectual activities such as contemplation, ritual, music, and science. The great Gnostic scholar Gilles Quispel believed that, for sure, the Hermeticists had no cult with priests, no sacrifices and processions, and the like. They were simply small hermetic communities, little conventicles or lodges, wherein individual experiences and insights were celebrated communally with rituals, hymns, and prayers. Now, it isn't the time or place here to discuss the specifics of Hermeticism, especially since it's in its very early and formative phase where we're at in our chronology. But there is another religious undercurrent, which is not mutually exclusive to Hermeticism, that I want to discuss, and that's the mysteries of Isis and Osiris. We've gone over mystery cults in general not too long ago, but here I want to give a few details that specifically pertain to the Greco-Egyptian mysteries. Now, the real impetus for the proliferation of mystery cults like these was the rise of individualism, the belief in fate, and the growth of superstition. But I don't want to be dismissive of how powerful an impact such cults could have on one individual. So, as mentioned before, if I remember correctly, our information about the mysteries is pretty scant, and for good reasons. The word mystery comes from the Greek mysterion, which in turn is derived from the Greek word muein, to shut one's lips. It is etymologically related to the English word mute, or the French muet, and an initiate, therefore, was called a mustez, the plural is mustai, with the implication of an individual whose lips are sealed. Now, there's also another meaning to this mueing word, and that's to shut one's eyes. Many scholars throughout the past 100 years or so have given a variety of interpretations to this. Marvin Meyer, of blessed memory, wrote that a second way to interpret the closed nature of the mysteries relates to the closing and the opening of the eyes. Closed eyes brought darkness to the prospective initiate, both literally and metaphorically, and the opening of the eyes was an act of enlightenment. Just as one of a baby's first responses to the world is the discovery of light through opening the eyes, so the initiate, sometimes described as one reborn, saw the light. Nocturnal initiatory ceremonies with flickering torches, accentuating the contrast between light and darkness, made that primal experience of enlightenment that much more vivid to the eyes and the emotions. If the experience of seeing was primary in the mystery religions, it may be anticipated that much visual imagery is to be discovered in the texts describing these ceremonies. End quote. Now, as much as I love and usually agree with Marvin Meyer, my problem with this interpretation is that if the emphasis is on seeing or beholding something, then why the hell would the word muein be of any use? It means to shut, not to open. The implication Meyer gives is that the shutting word is really about opening, and this is literally nonsense. What I suspect was going on here is just what's being said. People are shutting their eyes and then seeing things. This, among many other factors, is one of the reasons I believe that psychotropic substances, chiefly of the psychedelic variety, were being used, and it was quite literally behind the eyelids where the most vivid of visions were made. These were visionary cults, and to get into the visionary state, you need to shut out the world of the senses. One does not close their eyes to better see the temple's decorations. Sure, this contributes to the set and setting, but one closes their eyes to behold the visions of the goddess induced by all manner of shamanic techniques. My suspicion is that, of all scholars who have worked on the mysteries for the past 100 years, a good 99% have never actually had experiences like these, so they couldn't really imagine that it literally happened to someone else. This lack of personal experience is, as usual, where most scholarly accounts fail to get the big picture. Revelation was really the common thread between the mysteries of Isis and the more intellectual cult of Hermeticism, and I will fight tooth and nail to say that if you want to give everyone visions, not just seasoned mystics who've been living on mountains for 20 years, you need to slip them something in a sacrament. There's oodles of people who think anyone can achieve these states on the natch, and I highly doubt their claims. They might get the same message on the natch, but this experience cannot be replicated. And that's what gives the message all the more weight. This is more than just imagination at work. Now, there had been a sort of mystery tradition in Egypt long before the arrival of the Greeks, but it was quite different from this Alexandrian, syncretic, Eleusinian-style cult. What they had in common was that they were both ritualized dramas. Initially, these rites were reserved for royalty. The pharaoh would undergo initiation and thereby become one with Osiris. Over time, however, these kinds of rites were extended to priests, nobles, and even laymen. The Greek reconception of the Isis cult really solidified the universal character of the rites. It wasn't just Pharaoh who would enter the halls of Amenti. The afterlife was available to all who had been initiated. Osiris became a sort of universal savior god, as opposed to a kind of transdimensional pharaoh archetype. He came to represent the dying and rising of all things, of people, of plants, of the universe itself, not merely a representative of the death and resurrection of the God King. As early as the Old Kingdom, Isis had been introduced into the pantheon of Heliopolis around the time of the 5th dynasty, during which time she was depicted as wife to the deceased pharaoh. In this way, she had many associations with burial rituals. Her name appears over 80 times in the pyramid texts. By the Middle Kingdom, as the funeral texts proliferated among many members of Egyptian society outside the royal family, the role of Isis as protectress grew to include the protection of nobles and even lowly commoners. By the New Kingdom and the Hellenistic period, Isis seems to have become more prominent than her spouse. It's theorized that this displacement happened as Egyptian religion became more standardized and various cult centers were merged or syncretized. It was first in the Heliopolitan tradition that Isis became wife of Osiris and the mother of Horus and Ra. And this idea spread from there at a rather later period. Isis worship typically occurred in an Iseum, and as far as Egypt was concerned, Isis would have received similar offerings and rituals as other Egyptian deities. By the Greco-Roman period, the majority of Isaic priests and priestesses had a reputation as great magicians and healers. They were believed to have special powers, including dream interpretation and the ability to control weather. So here you can see a number of parallels between the cult of Isis and the Hermetic tradition, despite the fact that they are more or less separate traditions. We might think of the Egyptian intellectual world as a Venn diagram wherein these two circles have a fair deal of overlap. In late Egyptian mythology, it was said that Isis tricked Ra into telling her his secret name by making a snake bite him and exchanging the antidote for this divine formula. Once you know a being's secret name, one could achieve total power over them, hence why the names of gods and pharaohs were generally, if not always, written within cartouches, basically magical protection circles shaped like rounded rectangles. Secret names became central in many late Egyptian magic spells and a sine qua non of Hermetic ritual magic, especially when it comes to the invocation of planetary spirits. As early as the 5th century BC, Greek intellectuals like Herodotus had described Isis by comparison with the Greek goddess Demeter, whose mysteries at Eleusis offered initiates guidance in the afterlife and a vision of rebirth. After the Ptolemaic occupation had begun, this line of thinking reached its apogee, with Isis becoming the most important deity of the Egyptian pantheon on account of the centrality of magic in her divine portfolio. Here she became known as the Queen of Heaven. Soon after, a multitude of other Mediterranean goddesses, such as Demeter, Astarte, Cybele, Hera, and even the Arabian goddess Al-Uzza, these were all syncretically identified with Isis and ultimately with one another as well. If you're interested in learning more about the cult of Isis and Osiris, you want to learn from more or less primary sources, so go check out these following works. Plutarch's on Isis and Osiris, which discusses the couple's hierosgamos, their sacred marriage, in addition to the death and resurrection of Osiris. The next useful document is the Isis Eritology from Cumae, which is a big list of I am statements. That's what an eritology is. So, for example, I revealed the mysteries unto men. I taught men to honor the gods' images. I concentrated the precincts of the gods. I broke down the governments of tyrants. I made an end to murders. I compelled women to be loved by men. I made the right to be stronger than gold and silver. I ordained that the true should be thought good, and so on and so forth. Next, we have the Isis love spell from the great magical papyrus of Paris in the Bibliothèque Nationale, papyrus 574. This was written in Coptic and is therefore a late Egyptian document, and it describes the story of Osiris's adultery and the spell Isis used to make him return to her. Last but not least, we have Apuleius's golden ass. So, since I'm on this topic, I want to close with a little bit of historical fiction I've written, loosely based on this work by Apuleius, which is, by a long shot, our best document for reconstructing the mysteries of Isis. I wrote this as a chapter to my book of poetry and aphorisms called On Meditations on Meditations, which I published not terribly long ago under my pen name Mercurius Terminimus. As much as this account is purely fictional, I think it might be one of the better ways of conveying the sense of what initiation might actually have been like. So, here it is. The incense was choking. Sandalwood and saffron circulating the night, swirling out scented ethers far beyond dawn's dreaming rays. Torchlights twirled round the room, scintillating in all directions, gleaming off the various luxurious trinkets, the golden lamellae, the jade ibises, the porcelain crocodiles, the ageless stone statues that filled the hall. The first of the 12 layered robes, beautifully embroidered with all manner of zodiacal patterns, sloughed off the shoulder. Motionless, gazing off into an infinity of thoughts, the curtain dropped. There they were, gaping on in holy silence. Their shaved heads, their freshly washed linens, their lapis lazuli charms, their Indian serpents, and their thickly encrusted makeup. I paid them no heed. They knew what I was going through. They'd all done it before. No fast, no incubation, no procession, no purification could prepare me for this. That day I was high priest and holy lamb. She was lord of the hour. Time, the moving image of eternity, ceased its fractal fluctuations. You wouldn't understand. What gives you the right to compare? Then she came, like a star from the sea, the threefold, the maiden, the mother, the crone. A delightful feeling of weakness, a holy weakness of chattering teeth and crystalline dreams, like during childhood when a famine gripped the land so long its hunger pangs made mom euphoric. Paleness grew like that of snow-white mares in seasons of storm. Tears of joy further eroded the lines in my hands. We spend our whole lives dying to wake up. In the nights leading up to my initiation, the high priest had come to me in hyperspatial thoughts, and from that point on I had decided to be more solicitous of her image. I would bring her saffron and myrrh, libations of water, and what little gold I'd earned from selling my horse. I sat by the fire, and there I waited. I saw her, there, far away. Can you hear my voice? Answer me. There she was, bright as the sun. All this time I'd sought in vain. I'd ground the stones and plants, dyed the cloth and metal, fashioned the idol and mapped out the stars, tried as I might to evoke she who knows all names. I could not churn the engines of fate. I could not turn the cosmic wheels. I could not force her to act. She came to me, not when the darkness was filled with imagined beings, but when the dark became conscious. She came as I was persuaded that the darkness was not evil and the light was not good. The truth was good. Ignorance was evil. Tesseracts and hieroglyphs, fractal billows of insight, ambrosial sleep and feverish dreams. I'd been here before. Before the womb, before the wheels, before the chaos was over the deep, before the wet and lumpy, I knew her. Before the Word was made flesh, we all knew her. The rue was chewed, the acacia was burned in a censer. I drank from the cymbal, I ate from the drum, I plunged beyond the veil. A sense of exaltation. I felt lifted up, pulled up and out from my usual point of view. All fear melts away. The dais was not very high, but I felt high above the globe of the earth. The soul evacuates its temple tomb, sucked up toward the open sky. My dross to consume, thy gold to refine. Rising up the mainstay of heaven, the elements decomposed. I was not my sight, I was not my hearing, I was not my taste, nor touch, nor smell. All opposites were reconciled. The hot became the cold became the hot. The dry became the wet, and the wet became the dry. The ponderous waters fell back to the earth in a shower. The dust of my bones flitted away. The air became sparse, and the fire drew me on. Disembodied, roped in by a silver cord, I rose toward Khonsu's silvery gate. There, suspended in the chamber of secrets, I heard a familiar voice, each syllable a mournful song. There, in their fevered circles, a formless, ever-changing crack of silence. No lips have borne it, no ink has spilled it out on parchment page, no ossicles nor membranes shake in its sympathy. Then the colors appeared in a shadow of grace. Tired tropes, however, never truly tell the tale. Hecate's disk grew larger, waxing in her light as one propels toward its etheric body. I had always known all things in this world were born in their proper order, stemming from the All-Mother. The orders proceeded down from higher to baser things until reaching the sphere of the moon. By proceeding from the lower onto the higher orders, we'd begin in matter, and ultimately reach man, who is nobler than everything beneath the sphere of the moon. The moon was the first of the etheric bodies, my spiritual father had always told me. Gazing off, I suffered memories of places I'd never been, and a nostalgia for the womb, of times and ages long gone, of primordial gardens and cities of crystal mirrors. I'd always been a man of the treatise, but experiences like these turn you into a man of aphorism, nay, of hieratic silence. There is only one word. It is not a man, and the small mouth noises of man cannot make it. Thank you.